London in the 1500s was a city caught between two worlds. Medieval walls contained a booming Tudor metropolis where kings built palaces while disease lurked in every alley, where merchants grew rich on global trade while executioners sharpened their axes on Tower Hill. This was the London of Henry VIII and Elizabeth II, a city of approximately 50,000 souls that would double in size before the century ended. Using original Tudor maps, contemporary paintings, and detailed engravings from the period, we've reconstructed what this extraordinary city actually looked like. From the timber-framed shops of Cheapside to the royal barge processions on the Thames, subscribe and tell me in the comments which historical city I should bring back to life next. Stand at London Bridge in 1500 and look north. The view that greets you hasn't changed in 2 centuries, but it's about to. This is a city on the edge of transformation. The medieval street plan still dominates, narrow lanes barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. But new money is pouring in. The wool trade with Flanders has made London wealthy, and that wealth is starting to show. The church spires that puncture the skyline tell you everything about medieval priorities. Over 100 parish churches served a population that could fit inside a modern football stadium. Old St Paul's Cathedral towered above them all, its spire reaching 489 feet into the London sky, taller than any building in England. Lightning would destroy that spire in 1561, and it would never be rebuilt. Walk the streets, and you'd know exactly what each neighbourhood produced. The air itself was a map. Bread Street smelled of baking. Fish Street reeked of the day's catch laid out on wooden boards. Poultry sold chickens and geese. Milk Street was self-explanatory. These weren't quaint names bestowed by nostalgic historians. They were simple descriptions of what happened there every single day. This is Westminster in the early Tudor period, technically a separate city from London, connected by the Strand, a road lined with the mansions of bishops and nobles. Westminster Abbey dominates the scene, already 400 years old, and the coronation site of every English monarch since William the Conqueror. Across from the Abbey stands Westminster Hall, built in 1097, with the largest medieval timber roof in northern Europe. Kings held court here, parliaments assembled here, and in later decades traitors would be tried here, including Sir Thomas More and the Earl of Essex. But the real power centre was rising along the river. Henry VII had begun transforming the old Palace of Westminster, but his son would take royal building to unprecedented levels. Henry VIII would spend more on construction than any English monarch before him. His ambition would reshape London forever. The Thames was London's main street, and the most efficient way to travel. Shout oars from any of the dozens of landing stairs, and a wherryboat would pull alongside within minutes. These watermen were the taxi drivers of Tudor London, rowing passengers upstream to Westminster or downstream to Greenwich for a few pennies. Their boats clogged the river, thousands of them, dodging merchant vessels bringing wool, wine and exotic goods from every corner of the known world. The river served another purpose too. It was London's sewer. Every house, every shop, every slaughterhouse on the waterfront dumped directly into the Thames. At low tide, the mudbanks revealed a century's worth of refuse. Somehow Londoners still drew their drinking water from this same river. The connection between filthy water and disease wouldn't be understood for another 300 years. This is the Tower of London as it appeared in Tudor times, and it looked remarkably similar to the fortress we see today. The White Tower stood at its heart, built by William the Conqueror 400 years earlier. But by the 1500s, the tower had evolved into something more complex than a simple fortress. It was a royal residence, though monarchs rarely stayed there anymore. It was the royal mint where England's coins were struck. It housed the royal menagerie, where lions, leopards and an elephant were kept as symbols of royal power and exotic curiosity. But everyone knew the tower's real purpose. This was where enemies of the crown came to die. Anne Boleyn walked from her cell to the scaffold in 1536. Catherine Howard followed in 1542. Lady Jane Grey, Queen for just 9 days, met her end here in 1554. The tower didn't need high walls to terrify. Its reputation did that work. The execution site sat just outside the tower walls on Tower Hill, where public beheadings drew massive crowds. Londoners treated executions as entertainment and moral instruction combined. When a nobleman lost his head, thousands would gather to hear his final speech and watch the axe fall. The heads of traitors were then boiled, dipped in tar and mounted on spikes along London Bridge, a grotesque welcome for anyone entering the city from the south. Cheapside was the commercial heart of Tudor London, the widest street in the city and the most expensive place to do business. Goldsmiths displayed their work in shop windows fitted with actual glass, a luxury most Londoners never saw in their own homes. Mercers sold silk and velvet to nobles who could afford them. Every major royal procession passed down Cheapside, and merchants paid fortunes for the privilege of having shops along the route. At the eastern end stood the Great Conduit, one of several public fountains that brought relatively clean water into the city from springs in Hertfordshire. On special occasions, wine flowed from these conduits instead of water. When Anne Boleyn rode through London before her coronation in 1533, Cheapside ran with red and white wine. 3 years later, her head would roll. The Inns of Court sat just beyond the city walls, where young men studied law in buildings that looked more like colleges than legal chambers. Lincoln's Inn, Gray's Inn, and the Inner and Middle Temple trained the lawyers, judges, and administrators who ran England. These weren't just schools. They were elite social clubs where the sons of gentry learned to navigate power. The Great Hall at Gray's Inn hosted elaborate performances and masques. Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors premiered here in 1594. The gardens at Lincoln's Inn provided a green escape from London's crowded streets. Walk through the Temple today, and you're following the same paths Tudor lawyers walked, past buildings that survived both the Great Fire and the Blitz. The Royal Exchange didn't exist yet in early Tudor London. That would come in 1565, but Lombard Street already hummed with financial activity. Italian bankers had set up shop here in the 13th century, and their descendants still controlled much of England's credit. Merchants met in the open air or in the aisles of St Paul's Cathedral to negotiate deals. Papers were signed in taverns. Fortunes changed hands in alehouses. This informal system worked, but it was chaotic. England was still decades away from the sophisticated financial instruments that would make London a global capital. For now, it was enough to import wool and export cloth, to loan money to nobles and hope they paid it back, to bet on ventures to the New World that might return treasure or might disappear forever. Tudor London's markets operated every day except Sunday. Leadenhall Market had been feeding the city since the 1300s, selling meat, poultry and grain under a massive covered hall. Smithfield hosted a livestock market where farmers drove cattle, sheep and pigs through the streets to be sold and slaughtered. The noise was relentless. The smell was worse. Billingsgate specialised in fish, pulled fresh from the Thames or brought by cart from the coast. Women known as fishwives sold the catch, and their legendary profanity gave us the term Billingsgate language. Markets were where rich and poor mingled, where news spread faster than any printed pamphlet, where you could hear 5 languages in 5 minutes. Disease was London's constant companion. Plague struck repeatedly throughout the 1500s, though none as devastating as the Black Death 2 centuries earlier. When plague deaths reached a certain threshold, theatres closed, markets emptied, and anyone with money fled to the countryside. The poor had no such option. They stayed and died in numbers that were carefully recorded in the bills of mortality and just as carefully forgotten once the outbreak passed. Sweating sickness was worse in some ways. It killed quickly, sometimes within hours, and it seemed to prefer the wealthy. When an outbreak hit in 1528, London's elite panicked. Even Henry VIII fled his own capital, moving from palace to palace, trying to outrun infection. The disease vanished as mysteriously as it appeared, never to return. This is Greenwich Palace, Henry VIII's favourite residence, where he was born in 1491 and where both his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, would also be born. The palace sprawled along the Thames, a complex of courtyards, galleries and gardens designed for pleasure as much as power. Henry expanded it constantly, adding tilt yards for jousting and tennis courts for the game he obsessed over. The Royal Observatory wouldn't be built on the hill above Greenwich for another century, but the view from the palace was already spectacular. You could watch ships departing for distant continents, carrying English ambition to shores that appeared on no reliable map. The Thames here was wide and clean, far enough from London's filth to be almost pleasant. By 1600, London was bursting at its medieval seams. The population had doubled. New suburbs sprawled beyond the old walls. The seeds of the modern city had been planted, though no one living then could have imagined what would grow from them. The Tudor century transformed London from a medieval trading town into the foundation of what would become the world's largest city. The timber buildings that dominated this era would burn in the Great Fire of 1666. The palaces would crumble or be demolished, but the street plan endures. Walk through the City of London today, and beneath the steel and glass, you're still following the paths that Tudor Londoners walked 5 centuries ago. History has preserved countless images from lost worlds across the globe, engravings, paintings and maps waiting to be resurrected and brought back to life. Ancient Rome at its peak, medieval Paris before the Revolution, Constantinople before it became Istanbul. The possibilities are endless, and we want to know which city calls to you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the past.